Okay, time to get really started. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Edwards, Lilian for friends, of whom she has many. Lilian has a very rich history in internet law and has studied and written about basically any nut and bolt in our universe. She's been teaching in this domain for 25 years this year. Have you celebrated that?
No.
Oh, no, then we should. She's held chairs in Southampton, Sheffield, Strathclyde, and she's now at Newcastle University. And she's part seconded to the Ada Lovelace Institute, where she leads their work on the proposed EU AI regulation. She's first to do so, having entered the field of law and AI in 1985, around the same time as I did. So we're both a bit old, and that brings me to the next point. This all sounds like she's old and a bit boring, but she's actually far from it. She's very lively, energetic, and witty. And she is the co-chair and mother of Geeky, an annual series of workshops at the intersections between law, technology, and popular culture. And I'm hoping she will bring geeky elements in today's keynote, and the title of her talk indeed hints at that. So the next 50 minutes are for Lilian Edwards. Now, for the audience, I suggest that you post questions that come up during her talk in the Q&A. You see at the left hand, there should be a Q&A button, but there isn't at the moment. Or maybe there's not on my screen, but probably there's on yours. If not, you can also use the chat to have a sort of a running comments on what she's talking about and everything regarding Live the Universe and everything. And at the end of the talk, I will try to moderate the discussion. Now, please, Lilian, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Ronald. I will just set up screen share. Hang on. Okay, that should be it. We were just saying, oops, that one of the things I really hate about these otherwise rather fantastic conferencing systems is that you cannot see any of your audience. So you cannot see if everything has gone horribly wrong. You can't see if you've insulted everyone in the audience. So, and also I can't see the chat. So sorry, guys. I really hope someone will tell me if I've gone way off piste. But to kick off then, I'm very honored to be here today in your first iteration of this amazing event, which is full of lots and lots of people whom I incredibly respect. Also, thank you, Ronald, for that lovely introduction. I am feeling today a bit old and boring, so let's hope that things improve. As we just agreed, we're all dragging to the end of term or to Christmas as we go under in a siege of email and Omicron viruses. But anyway, so I gave this title ages ago, really just off the top of my head, because of some of my own frustrations at the time. And I called it The Unbearable Inflexibility of Regulating AI. And everyone went, oh, she's read Milan Kundera. And the truth is, I did about 30 years ago, but mainly I really liked the film. But anyway, yeah, The Unbearable Inflexibility did seem a good way to refer to many of the problems in looking at the proposed AI regulation or AI Act, as it's being called, because of the way in which it's trammeled on the one hand by the new legislative framework, which isn't very new, it's nearly as old as me, and also by some aspects of EU internal market law. And I'll explain why I find that particularly frustrating. So first of all, yeah, I was going to start with the usual picture of, you know, like neural networks or AI or data or the matrix. And then I thought, no, yeah, let's say what I really feel about AI. And this is how I feel about AI, for which read machine learning. You know, so here we have James Bond wearing his nice maroon velour jacket. And the pattern matching algorithm decides that the next Bond will indeed be a nice velour sofa. And that really, to some extent, sums up everything. But anyway, right, so the proposed EU AI Act, as we know, the proposal came out in April. Things have moved on a little bit, but not very much. We've had a very large number of responses in consultation from civil society. And we have just, as in about a week ago, I think, had the leak or the disclosure of the draft council position, which is very interesting in lots of ways, actually, particularly because it was essentially conceived without German intervention, because the new German government hadn't been decided at that point. And yet, despite that, which would now, one assumes, be a liberal influence towards greater emphasis on civil liberties, the draft council position already, to my eyes, made several significant changes, which were really quite surprising in the direction of pushing the Act towards protecting fundamental rights and away from the emphasis on protecting innovation. So again, I might come back to some of that, although I haven't gone into detail about it in this talk. So as Ronald said, I have since July been attempting to understand and poke holes in the AI Act for the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is a major think tank or NGO in the UK devoted to the problems of data in society, and particularly to putting users and vulnerable groups and people at the heart of the regulation of data in our society. So this is not a talk by Ada. I want to make that very clear. This is a talk by me, in which I will express my own views, some of which may be a lot more cynical than Ada's, but it is obviously informed by the work that I've been doing there, and I'll mention some of their adjunct work. So as I say, I will give a brief summary of some parts of the Act, but not huge, because I suspect this audience, very many people, are quite steeped in it, and I saw at least a few people who know a lot more about it than I do. But I will give a summary for some points, because I want to lead into, particularly one key problem that I have found unbearably inflexible. And that's really what this talk is about my problems in trying to square various circles in trying to improve the AI Act. And I'll try and talk a little bit about why I have been banging my head against this squared circle for what feels like years, 6 months. Why is it so hard to get it right? And why does this speak to me, somebody living in Britain, right? I'm looking at this picture that I took from The Guardian of Britain floating away from the EU, big sob emoji. Because obviously we're affected, right? The significance of this exercise is global. And that is not just because of the legalistic aspect of it being extraterritorial jurisdiction, which we're already familiar with from the GDPR and now other instruments. So, if the UK is trying to build AI to be the world leader in AI, as we keep saying, then we are going to have to, whether they like it or not, we are going to have to obey how the AI Act comes out. You can work out for yourself who they is in that sentence, I think. Because if we put the systems onto market in the EU, we are going to have to obey your laws. But more rhetorically, more normatively, obviously, there is this race going on. It's always a race, the space race, the drugs race, to get first mover advantage in making the global model for regulating AI. And we're seeing, obviously, increasingly swift moves in this direction from, China, the US, the UK, some of which I'm involved in. And they take more or less stances on what they see as the good in that regulatory regime. Is the good pro-innovation? For the UK, it certainly is right now. If you look at any of our recent policy documents, is the good fundamental rights? Well, that's what the AI Act is meant to highlight. It mentions it, I think, 81 times. Every time I do a Control F search, I seem to get a different number, but I think it's 81 times. Is it the good of society rather than individuals, which is arguably what the Chinese model is trying to promote? We shall see. So that's the stakes, as it were, for me. So why is the current regulatory proposal, the current regulatory regime that the AI Act is putting forward, why is it unbearably inflexible, right? Which I sometimes call, you know, the sea shanty song of the new legislative framework. Sing it with me, you know? So I think probably, again, this audience is probably aware that the AI Act is a bit of a Frankenstein creature, as I think Michael Veal said last one I saw him giving, but it is primarily modeled from the product safety legislation and the new legislative framework that came in the EU since the 80s. And this is designed to ensure that products moving into the European market, the European internal market, are safe, right? And it therefore comes under the heading of, you know, protecting consumers and of creating harmonization within the internal market at a satisfactory minimum level, right? And then we move on to maximum harmonization, which other people here are more of an expert in than me, but we'll come back to that. So why have we adopted a model drawn from product safety to regulate AI systems, which aren't products and aren't very like products, even when they're embedded in products, you know, which is Annex 2, which is that set of AI services that are embedded in products are included in high risk. Because AI, as we all know, is much more like a life cycle. It's not even the difference between a product and a service. AI is a dynamic process, you know, in which the models add data, they are retested, they learn, the models are recalibrated. And more than that technical process of learning and change, which is so emphasized in the literature, I think the point is that there is a life cycle of the adaptation, deployment, and use of what we are calling AI. I will take the word AI right now, but imagine scare quotes at all points, right? You know, so you may have, you know, a system that is built in a research lab that is put out as open source, that is taken up by a startup who want to deliver some kind of machine learning as a service, which is then picked up by a commercial provider who sell into a public local government provider of welfare benefits. Yeah, this is one example that I've made in the ADA position paper that I'm drafting right now. At that point, right at the end of that cycle, when it is picked up by the local authority, the public body, to deliver welfare benefits, at that point, by the characterization in Annex 3, you would assume that it becomes a high-risk system, but it hasn't necessarily gone through any substantial modification or change. I mean, because we don't really know what these words mean, right? We have a great difficulty here in knowing, without going through detailed case studies, which I hope are to come, who should be responsible at what point for what duties, under what kind of framework. Is it their intended use, which is the framework that's mostly used by the AI Act? Should it be their foreseeable use, which is what I think Buke have been pushing, perhaps EDRI? Should it be their reasonably foreseeably likely use? Or should we simply be imposing duties at every stage on, as I say, not just providers, but adapters, deployers, and end users? And is that feasible within the balance between pro-innovation, deregulation, and regulation to prevent adverse impacts on society? You know, if we start to impose those duties all the way down the line of uncertain scope, will that be acceptable to industry who do have to have buy-in to this? Yeah, and the analogy I keep drawing in my head, which would be very familiar to some people in the audience, probably most, is what we have been seeing with the GDPR, which has developed, you know, since over the last 30 years, you know, since the original directive, from saying, oh, there are data controllers who are really in charge, and then there are data processors who are like the warehouse, you know, that just do the job for you, and they don't really have any responsibilities except keeping the data safe. we've developed to a much more complicated, much more difficult, but much more nuanced model in the last few years of saying, well, you know, when you look at a complex system like, say, ad tech, we have multiple actors who are data controllers at various points for various parts of the data or the processing of the data. And we have to try and work out who should be responsible for what at what time. It's a whole new world. And I feel that although that is difficult, at the moment, the AI Act is ducking that difficulty. And maybe then we'll have to have 30 years of development in the case law to get there. Who knows? Or maybe we can deal with it within the process right now. So yeah, to summarize all that, how are we dealing with the problem of placing duty on providers, who I think are seen very much as analogous to the manufacturers in the product safety regime, the people who make dishwashers, say, when many of the harmful impacts will come from the context of use. And I almost use use there in both the sense of the AI Act, which is the person who deploys it, and also in the more usual context of use by users, by end users. And I think, again, that piece of terminology in the AI Act, which I'll mention later, is very unfortunate. And I would strongly suggest that user be replaced with deployer or possibly adapter. So again, drawn from the new legislative framework model, we have this model. If you think about the original idea of an unsafe product, a toy or a dishwasher, then to make it safe, you have rules that are very technical, right? And if you go and look at them, which is what I think Catalina Goanta did a wonderful talk where she read out bits, you look at these and they're incredibly technical, right? The rules are developed into technical standards, which say things like the copper wire has got to be this thick and it's never got to run for longer than 4 meters at this point, you know. The dishwasher, even if it goes through 4 cycles, should never get higher than a temperature of 210 degrees centigrade, something like that. So very technical. So in that context of dynamically changing technical standards where you need sort of scientific and industry know-how, standard setting as a rulemaking procedure by technical committees makes sense, right? But as we all know, and this is a very ventilated complaint, translating that model into the AI Act, where we are asking technical committees to make rules, not just about the thickness of the copper wire or the heat of the machine, but about whether systems impede or impact adversely on the fundamental rights of individuals and groups is a bit mad, right? So that's a whole set of problems which have been very well ventilated, I think, in quite a lot of the civil society submissions. And we have a number of possible solutions for that, which we're exploring at ADA. I personally do rather like one idea that sort of came out of the Beat paper, which, as you can tell, I'm very fond of, which is that maybe there should be a standing technical resource funded by the Commission or by various EU bodies jointly, which should offer technical resources, solutions, test beds, etc., to civil society as a whole, so that they can engage with the technical committee standard setting process. But that presupposes that civil society are getting access to those technical committees, which is a big presuppose. Anyway, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this below. One problem is, as I've said, the requirements that were looked at that were made into standards in the product safety model were pretty technical, right? So they might be expensive, but they were achievable. If you look at the essential requirements that are to be certified as met by high-risk AI in the AI Act, then you really do start to wonder, is it not just that, you know, these people don't understand fundamental rights, but are these requirements actually technically feasible? You know, and I have particular worries about this in relation to Article 14 on human oversight. So these are all mini talks, right, that I'm just running over to show you the problems that are arising from the wholesale adoption and adaptation of the new legislative framework. One key problem that I am going to return to is, this model that was designed to certify the safety of dishwashers or toys before they went on the market naturally assumed that the manufacturers pretty much knew everything. They were the best people in charge to know the capabilities and the latent flaws or possible impacts of their goods or services, right? So you didn't really need to talk to the users. The dishwasher arrives in my house. I just recently got a new washing machine. I could use that. It gets installed by somebody from John Lewis. I don't really need to have input into whether it's been built to be safe. But that is not true, as we all know, when we start to look at the possible adverse impacts of AI systems on the rights and interests. So we're not just talking fundamental rights, I think, but also societal interests, such as sustainability, such as efficacy, such as autonomy. We need to talk to users about these things. And that's one of the big points that we're pursuing at ADA. Yeah. So much of the debate, again, kicked off by very good papers like the Wieland Borgesius one, and kicked off in the various civil society papers, has focused a great deal on rights of complaint or challenge at the end, if you like, when the impact has been felt, when the system has been put into operation and something horrible has happened, or it's gone wrong, or it's created bias or discrimination. Then why don't users have well-organized rights of complaint or challenge? Why don't we have the kind of procedures that we're now seeing emerging as very important within the GDPR, such as the ability of civil society to take place in instigating representative actions? And we all know the story, the story of Max Schrems, the story of NOIB, the story of AWO, in which, given that for various reasons, enforcement of the GDPR by the state regulators is buckling under the strain, we know that the activity of individuals or of organizations in civil society has been crucial in making the GDPR enforcement work to the extent that it does work in the last few years. But having said that, I think that we can over-concentrate on that last piece of the puzzle of giving users rights of complaint and challenge and actions, which I wholly support. But there are at least two other inflection points where the voice of the user is not heard in the AI Act. One is at that original point of production, of provision, of design. Yeah. So, where is the user-focused design element? That is a tough one, and that is what I want to talk about a little bit later. And the other one, obviously, I've already mentioned, is in the middle, which is in creating the standards that will effectively act as rules in this game. How do we get the user voice in there? Conventionally, that's done by civil society involvement. In fact, conventionally within the NLF technical committees, it's done by the involvement of ANEC. One body will not do. But, there are other ways of doing this, and I wonder if we should start thinking about it. For example, I saw a very interesting recent paper in which the voice of the user concerning apps was assessed using the star ratings and complaints that they made on the app stores. And I thought that was very interesting. Crowdsourcing of user interaction. I mean, we live in a world of social media, and yes, it would be partial, and yes, it wouldn't be representative, and yes, the people who actually make comments or complaints on app stores are not representative, and they will be the people with an axe to grind. But that is probably also true of civil society, to be honest. So what I'm just saying is that we need to think about getting the user voice in lots of ways that may be not just resourcing civil society, which is absolutely necessary, but we can go beyond that. Another avenue that ADA has been pursuing is the use of citizen juries, for example. Could we have standing panels, perhaps organized by the EU AI board, which the Act doesn't really seem to know what to do with, who could represent views, who could be demographically selected in these various standard setting committees? Yeah, there's an idea. So the last one of these everyone knows about, because we've adopted the model from the new legislative framework. It kind of looks, when you first look at it, like it's got third-party audit in the form of notified bodies, but actually it's mostly self-certification. And we have post-market surveillance by market surveillance authorities, who are quite likely to also be data protection authorities, and they are already overwhelmed, overworked, and arguably, in some cases, complicit with industry. And is it really going to help to also put this burden on them of being market surveillance authorities? Okay, that was an awful lot in one slide, because really I didn't want to go into all of those in detail, but perhaps I should have done more to say why the current system doesn't work in so many ways, why it is unbearably inflexible and so difficult to change. You know, and this is where I always invoke, as usual, the old Yorkshire joke, you know, and I've just been in Yorkshire for the weekend, and it's very true that if you ask somebody, how do I get to Skipton from here when you're in Edinburgh, they will go, well, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. And I don't know if I would have started from here. But having gone through all those problems, there's actually a different problem, which is really, really, really the one that's been bugging me in the entire time I've been working for ADA. And that's what I want to go on to. And that is, why do they call it a risk-based approach anyway? Okay, so, okay, everyone knows this triangle by now. I am not going to read it all out. We have 4 categories of risk. We have unacceptable risk, we have high risk, we have limited risk, and we have minimal risk, okay? Limited risk is a complete waste of time, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm not even going to talk about it, because all it does is give a few AI systems transparency obligations. And truly, given that under the GDPR, you have the right to discover the existence of automated processing or profiling, with a little bit of doubt around the Article 22 question. Why shouldn't all AI systems simply proactively say that they are AI systems? You know, I do not see a need for a whole separate category for that. So most of the talk, obviously, is about unacceptable risk and high risk. And the point about calling it a risk-based approach, you know, I am not an idiot, I have learned this, is that it means it's not a blanket approach of regulation for all AI systems, which would arguably have been very anti-pro-innovation, you know, very burdensome for startups, all the usual arguments. But to me, when I first looked at it, coming naively, not really from an EU insider Brussels wonk perspective, I went, this is not risk-based, right? Why did I keep saying that? So there's, yeah, just to update you, there's the list of prohibited systems, the red lines. I'm not going to go into them. And there, this is useful just to look at, but I'm not going to go into it. Here is the list in Annex 2. Here are the lists in Annex 2 and Annex 3 of the AI services or products, as in AI system embedded in a product, that are designated to be high risk, either because they are an existing legislation from the NLF, which is Annex 2, or because they have been designated in Annex 3 as having an intended use in one of these domains. Okay, and that's where a lot of the action is right now. And as you know, what I've just been talking about, if you do fall into one of those classes in either Annex 2 or Annex 3, then the system, the high-risk AI system, is required to certify its compliance with the essential requirements of Articles 8 to 15. And as I've been saying, you know, these are going to be burdensome. They are going to be quite a business, right? Particularly perhaps Article 10 and Article 14. And so this is a big deal, whether you are a high-risk AI system. But really, is this really risk-based? Okay, that's my geeky bit, Ronald. If anyone doesn't know, I just love this GIF from One Division. This is also the geeky bit. Originally, I had a video, but I took it out. So to me, as a kind of, UK private lawyer, risk-based legislation means a really different thing. It means that there are criteria as to whether a system reaches or is likely to reach a certain level of risk. Now, those criteria to me are really important because they give legitimacy as to whether the system should be regarded as high risk or indeed prohibited risk. And therefore, the makers of the system have to go through with this burdensome piece of regulation or perhaps withdraw their system from the market. There has to be some kind of societal uptick on both sides, on industry and on users, as to why there is legitimate calling out, I think, of the system. What are these risks, right? So it should be transparent. It should be transparent as to why the system has failed to meet these criteria for being a safe system, to go back to the model of the new legislative framework. And that means that it makes it challengeable, which also seems to me to be part of the rule of law and of due process, right? Concepts which are not really found in this very economic, very internal market-based piece of law. And also we've got this issue, which is slightly adverted to, and we'll come to this, in the Act, that if you know why it's been designated to be high risk, let's say, then you can work out why future systems, future new types of AI, because they will arise or they will mutate, why new types of systems should be added to the high risk list. So that's what we call future proofing, right? The video I was going to show here was about the points-based system from The Good Place, which I really, really hope quite a lot of you will have seen. And the nature of The Good Place points-based system is that it adds up every act you've done during your life. And here you can see the points that have been allocated and decides if you've been a good person during your life, in which case you go to the good place, which is heaven, or you go to the bad place, which is hell. And the point that is made very cogently in, this very silly series is that these points are arbitrary, right? They don't take into account context. They don't take into account, how likely it is that you had the resources to do these things. They've been arbitrarily assigned, why should ruining an opera with boorish behavior get 90 negative points? And even so, this is a more transparent and challengeable set of criteria than the AI Act gives you for putting a system into high risk, right? Because we don't know what the points are. We don't know what the points are that led them to put, say, deep fakes into limited risk rather than into high risk. We don't know why biometric surveillance in various ways is in prohibited risk, but not biometric categorization, which can perform exactly the same adverse effects, say, on surveilling and monitoring and organizing ethnic populations in China. So I would argue that, and this is what struck me throughout the system, throughout my time looking at this, that we've got to do more about this, that this is very risky, risk-based legislation because it is arbitrary, right? Now, a policy wonk at this point will say, well, it's all politics, right? I get that. I get that biometrics are extremely sensitive. I get that there is very little consensus between some member states on whether to ban, all biometric surveillance, law enforcement biometric surveillance, real-time biometric surveillance as opposed to post-hoc biometric surveillance, surveillance in private places as well as in public places, etc. Perhaps that is irrevocably political, although I'm sure many, many people here would completely disagree. But we also see this arbitrariness in the high-risk lists, which I think is less defensible on the grounds of political maneuvering, as it were. So the new draft council position that just came out adds insurance systems that quantify insurance premiums, and it adds critical digital infrastructure, which is not that unvague. But it doesn't say why. I went and looked up the kind of little progress paper that came out with the leaked document, and it says the provisions defining the rules for classification of high-risk AI have been thoroughly revised to ensure better legal clarity and readability of the text. Well, that's nice. I'm glad they fixed the typos, but I would rather have had a set of clear rule of law challengeable criteria as to why these have been added and not others, such as emotion ID, which I personally find indefensible as a system to put on the market, in that it has no scientific validity to create good and only has the ability to create adverse discrimination and hate. So yeah. Then we just get the list of areas has been revised and extended. So no criteria, no narrative, no legitimacy, right? Another point about this kind of arbitrary buckets risk system is that it depends on intended use. Now, a number of civil society organizations have noted that intended use, well, what you intend doesn't necessarily happen. Should it be foreseeable use? Should it be reasonably foreseeable use? But even if you start with intended use, as I say, a biometric categorization system, that decides if people are Muslims, say, or black, or, look like terrorists, as opposed to actually identifying them. A system like that that's used to persecute ethnic minorities looks a lot different from one used to decide something that's economically useful. Such as, do we think that Asian people are more likely to shop in this part of the department store as they move around the shop, right? So I think the intended use combined with the arbitrary list really, really doesn't create a legitimate system of risk categorization, okay? Now, interestingly, a lot of this point, which I thought was a bit in the wilderness, has been picked up just in the last week or so, annoyingly, but also gratifyingly, by the position paper that's come out from a very large number of civil society groups, okay? And you can look it up for yourself. I put the URL at the bottom. Now, the problem, obviously, with a qualitative criteria-based high-risk system, I just noticed the time, is that, people may game it. Why would anyone certify as high risk if they didn't have to? Why wouldn't they just say, oh, we're low risk, we're fine? Well, there are ways of meeting that. An obvious one is, again, to have some kind of third-party audit, but you're getting into money and time. Another one that's on the cards is to use product liability as a kind of carrot. So maybe if you self-certify correctly and then you show that you went through the essential requirements and that you mitigated all your risks, then if there is a harm down the line because of the defect in the AI system, then maybe you don't get done for product liability, or maybe your liability is reduced considerably. Whereas if you lied effectively or were negligent in your categorization, maybe there should be a premium penalty fine put on you, so millions becomes trillions or whatever. So these are all to be thought about. One thing I wanted to say briefly, because I realize I'm running out of time, is that there is already quite a good set criteria lurking in the Act for defining what is high risk. And it is in Article 7, which is about not deciding what is high risk, but about adding new high risk systems under the existing categories at some future point. And I very much, again, stress the point that how can you add new categories on the grounds that they are as risky as the ones that are already there, not categories, systems or services, sorry. How can you tell if they are going to create equivalent or greater harm or adverse impact if you don't know why the systems that are there already are there, right? You haven't got a benchmark. So one suggestion I might have is that if we were to go to what I regard as a true risk-based criteria system for deciding what is high-risk AI, we could use this very nice set of criteria that are already sitting here. in Article 7. Now, at this point, various people in the audience will tell me this can't be done. Why? Well, this is back to the unbearable inflexibility. I am not going to really go into this one because I am not an EU internal market lawyer, but I am told that there would be constitutional problems under Title 114, which is the internal market ground for the legislation, in not having a set list for all of these risk buckets originally. I think what we're going to do at ADA is maybe instruct some further research on that. But there is a more practical problem, which is how much is all this going to cost, right? So here's the current system. Yeah, all the AI systems, as defined very widely, go into are defined in their buckets, and we have the essential requirements for high risk AI. What I'm proposing is that there is a new set of procedures that have to be gone through where there is an assessment of whether the system is high risk and possibly of unacceptable risk as well, but that would be more controversial. And then we would proceed to the rest of the system as it is now. Transition. I learned how to do transitions last night. Now, as I said last night, you very might need to add some kind of third-party audit to this assessment stage. And I think many of us, including the European Data Protection Supervisor, are also suggesting that there has to be less self-certification and more third-party audit at that stage. So now we've really getting to a slightly complex system for all AI systems. Another thing to think about is what might be the interaction of the essential requirements with my new assessment module. So if, for example, you assessed or were assessed as high risk and went on to the essential requirements, and during that process of certification it appeared that there were serious issues, then it might not be possible, for example, to meet the human oversight standards, or only to meet them partially. Then should it go back? Should you perhaps then be assessed to see if you are unacceptable risk? Could it work the other way? If you came through this with flying colors, could you be reassessed as minimal risk? So we end up with quite a complex system. But, and I'm not going to talk about this much because I've only got 4 minutes, there is a point that I made earlier which has really dropped out of this discussion, which is, where is the user in this? Where is the consideration for the user's voice, for their representation, particularly of those marginalized communities whom, as we know, are most likely to suffer the adverse impacts, right? And least likely to be represented in a standard setting process. So these are the values in the AI Act that we've been discussing at ADA, particularly how do we really assess impacts on fundamental rights, because very little in the essential requirements actually deals with that. And how do we look at these wider harms than just individual fundamental rights, such as harms to groups, such as representation and distributive harms. And then there are all these other values which aren't really very much, except maybe in the margins, really interrogated in the AI Act. Do we actually need these systems? Are there alternatives? Is it bad for human autonomy that we put these systems in when we don't actually need to? What about sustainability? What about the environment? I saw today, and from the Financial Times, a pretty reputable source, that now 30% of the electricity burnt in Ireland is to keep their data centers going. And so they're really beginning to rethink that part of their economy. So, this isn't just a problem about the blockchain, it's a problem about AI and the digital economy in general. But then, this is what I was getting to, there is this thing about, could this be a place, just as DPIAs could be, to put in the voice of users? So here is where I got to, right? And here is adding the algorithmic impact assessment, which can bring in not only the user voice, but all these other harms or issues, which at the moment are really pretty much not found either in my Imagine new module here or over here, except very passingly, right? Now, this is beginning to look really burdensome, right? We have three things going on. Can we combine them? Maybe. Maybe these could be combined. I'm not sure. The timing might not work. Getting users involved might not work. Might work better if we go to some of the models I was talking about, like having a standard user panel. But is this not all so burdensome now for your imagined startups coming into the market that no one will accept it? Well, again, one solution there might be, as some have suggested, to reduce the number of systems that have to go through this whole process, right? So we reduce the definition of AI systems to smaller, and we basically leave out all the stuff that we already have in the world, which is data-based software systems, right? So maybe we reduce this to machine learning. Now, the jury is out on that one. There seem to be really good voices on either side, some of them saying, no, 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 we must not do that. We must not reduce the scope of AI systems because lots of the really harmful systems are the legacy, rule-based, very simplistic systems, and we shouldn't leave them out. On the other hand, we have people like the kind of Veal-Borghesius wing saying maximum harmonization is a real problem with this act, and therefore reducing the scope of AI systems might really be helpful in not stopping member states from introducing higher protection, perhaps for various sectoral AI areas. So yeah, that's the problem. The problem is this balance, as you all know, between proactive governance to protect fundamental rights and, unquote, permissionless innovation. Yeah. And maybe, you know, all of these ideas that I've been working through really just tip the scales too far towards rights and too far away from pro-innovation. And maybe that's why the unbearable inflexibility of the EU Act is a good thing. You know, you work through all these things and you come around in the end to saying, I'm not sure this can work. And that's what I've been grappling with. So I'm very, very happy to hear thoughts from people. And I'll just stop there and leave that screen just for you to look at for 2 seconds, because I know I haven't got time, to say, in the end, you go through all this work and you go like, is it really worth it? You know, is AI just a hype bubble? Is it just snake oil? And I recommend here very strongly the book that has just come out from Federica Caltuner on fake AI, which is all about this. And I have already read a couple of the chapters and they're great. And there's also this idea of sectoral AI regulation. But I'll stop there and let everyone shout at me.
My microphone is working now. Thank you, Lilian, for this elaborate overview of a small section of the big beast called the AI Act, also known as the Frankensteinian monster and what have you. Thank you very much for that. And what you've clearly shown is that if you drill down in the act, the more you drill down, the more questions arise, and the more puzzling it all becomes. And yet it's also clear that we have to do something. And indeed, there are many factions that have different opinions on what to do. Whether, I mean, my personal one is, and that was in the ADA discussion recently, why the focus on AI in the first place? Why not on any system that potentially induces harm on people? And of course, there the discussion is complex, etc., because for all sorts of reasons. But I'm not going to hijack the floor here. I've gotten myself into a bit of a mess with the instructions that I gave people at the beginning by asking them to ask questions in the Q&A box, and I see some things that I don't consider to be questions there. Some other people may have questions, so I'm going to ask people to raise their hand if they want to take the floor. There was a question raised by Lynette Taylor early on about who is the user, but I think that question is now a bit off the table because you talked more extensively about that later on, and there was also a bit of discussion going on in the conversation. So let me see what happens. Can I? Because I'm trying to go through conversation, and I'm not entirely sure how I can see who wants. Is there anyone who wants to take the floor? Please signal that in chat or the Q&A.
Can I just say, Ronald, just to all the people saying, yeah, I hope it did become clear. I'm very aware, and maybe I should have put that up there to start with, that user in the sense of the AI Act terminology does not mean end user. And as I say, I think that is one of the key problems, and it should be replaced by deployer or adapter, or perhaps a range of such things. But as I hope became clear, I was worried about the adverse impacts to users and groups in the old-fashioned sense, subjects, if you like.
Yeah, no, indeed, and I think you were clear on that, so that's why I'm parking that a little bit. But there is a question, a concise question by Frederick, who you mentioned a couple of times already, and I'll read out the question because then we don't have to juggle with giving the floor, etc. Would it be better to regulate AI only in sector-specific targeted rules?
Yeah, that's my microphone. Yeah, I think that's the key question. Yeah, unsurprisingly. I think I am leaning towards that myself. Whether it's politically viable, I don't know at this stage of the game, because it is very clear that there is this race on to become the first mover in providing the global standard for the all singing, all dancing, AI harmonized regulation, right? And again, I loved the framing from Frederick Kautuner's book, in her introduction, which is that people are rattling the specter of artificial general intelligence, which isn't going to happen for a very long time and may never happen, to make us worry, to make us feel that there immediately needs to be holistic regulation of AI. And that is a scam, that is the fake AI. So in terms of whether it would be better, more practical, more concrete, more achievable, I think all of these things, yes, would be better met by starting off with sector specific. And what I was going to say, and I think the second last slide, because I realized I'd gone on and on, is that I think we're seeing this happen actually, not within the AI Act, but at least in the UK, within the labour sector. We're seeing this huge sudden deluge of really interesting impact assessments, toolkits, draft bills, etc., dealing particularly with labor and the gig economy and automated and data-driven performance management within that sector. So that's an obvious place to start.
But then that raises the immediate question, what do you mean by sector?
Mm.
How do we determine what is a sector, given that, one of the reasons why the AI Act tries to bring everything together is because it's very difficult to make a clear demarcation between various things, and therefore let's lump everything together. And of course, if you look at Annex 3, then you see 8 categories of systems, but that's relatively arbitrary, and also has a very strong public sector focus, which is also not exactly where I would imagine many of the risks to be.
No, this is where I think Lynette Taylor, who's asking questions, probably has a better answer than me. I think it would be a matter of not focusing on the technologies, but of focusing on the actors, right? So the people who have power to create negative impacts over others, of which labor is a very good example, right? When you're talking about automated hiring, when you're talking about gig management, I think it's relatively possible there to define data-driven systems that are creating adverse impacts, in terms of bias, in terms of group discrimination, in terms of, rebuttal of autonomy. So something there about the actor and impacted user network would as the focus, I think, rather than the technology itself.
Yeah. Okay, then there's a question in the conversation by Maya Maiter. Can you see the question? I'm not sure if everybody can. Yeah, probably everybody can see it. But thanks. Where is the AI and ethics debate?
Oh, I don't know. Is the straight answer to that. It might possibly be better to say the AI and ethics industry. I was reading something yesterday, a paper about how, there would still be a need for, the 10,000 industry-focused AI ethics codes, guidance, toolkits, etc., that we have, because they would provide greater obligations on top of the AI Act. But that takes you back to, to blue washing. It takes you back to self-assessment. It takes you back to the interest. Why are these companies interested in further certificating their ethical approach to AI? And I'm a lawyer, and I would rather have a higher standard of protection in the law than a higher standard in ethical practices, which are not mandated by the law. But of course, what we have within the AI Act is law that may, as it stands, be very, very badly enforced, in the sense of, the self-certification and the problems with post-market surveillance. So this is one of the many points where I go, I don't know. This is beyond my pay grade. But my general feeling is I always prefer law to ethics. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay, maybe one final question, and I've given Joris van Hoboken the floor because I figured out how to do that while you were talking.
I don't know. I never tested this. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Ah, wonderful. Thanks so much, Lilian, for a great talk. That was really, really insightful. You talked about this problem of the way that the responsibilities are being set up in the AI Act. And to me, that really struck me as a very particular kind of choice where I think the trigger for like the producer is like, whether you put it on the market with your brand and things like that. So it doesn't really connect to the more kind of organizational and technical setup in the way that the systems are produced. And you, I think, rightfully contrasted that with the GDPR, where now we have this quite productive conversation to understand, how does responsibility actually work in a networked setting. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you think we're losing by not trying to dive a little bit deeper into the complexities of the value chain of the production of AI. It's like, it seems to me also this area is so dominated by just a handful of companies, and like that seems to maybe.
Oh, where did yours go?
I don't know. I didn't do anything, but maybe you can start. I'll give you 1 minute for a bit of an answer, because we also people need to.
I'm glad you haven't tumbled down the circle into hell. Obviously, the place where this debate is being carried out the most in the AI Act is in relation to general purpose AI, right? So you have these, these Google, Amazon, Apple, whatever systems, you have GP3T, which is the one everyone looks at, that are upstream that have no intended use. And then you have downstream adaptations by people who are using it for things you never thought of in your life, some of which may, then create extreme bias and discrimination effects. But with the best will in the world, they may not have access to reach upstream and either get access to the data that's gone into the training sets and the testing sets, or to alter those systems, which I think is perhaps the key point. How are they going to make change at the top? So again, there are people here who know more about this than me, Stochastic Parrots et al. It is really interesting that they tried to address a tiny bit of that in the draft council position, but then they mess it up, right? In that they try and put a bit of responsibility on the deployer, but they take all the responsibility away from the upstream provider who's actually got the capacity and the resources to make the changes, So it's a big problem. And I just think we're at the start of trying to deal with that. As I was saying, it's taken, 30 years to get to the point where this case law is emerging in the GDPR. Yeah. And really, I feel we need here the people who understand better system processes, flows, software management cycles. Looking at yours, I'm thinking about SADA. Yeah. We need these people. We don't need me. We don't need private lawyers. We need people who understand, who actually has the power and the resources and the assets to make changes in these systems and monitor at any given time, right? But I do think that the GDPR is kind of a model, and I'm really keen to see what people like SADA and Lynette do with this, yeah.
Okay, I'm terribly sorry that I have to cut the discussion short here, but I invite everybody to go to the network bar and try and convene in smaller batches to take things further, or take lunch, which is also a necessity, I think. And thank you very much, Lilian, for this wonderful presentation. I hope you stay around for a bit.